Dante Reynolds had been in some awkward situations before, but nothing, absolutely nothing, came close to standing in front of a pair of confused police officers while an outraged white woman in a floral sun hat screamed about him, breaking into a fence. It was, without a doubt, a moment that could only be described as a mix of absurd, hilarious, and outright infuriating. "Officer, I told you. He's not supposed to be here. He was fiddling with the lock, and I knew something was wrong." Karen Whitmore's voice had the high-pitched intensity of someone auditioning for the role of neighborhood hero in a low-budget drama. Dante, wearing a navy polo with his company's logo stitched into the chest, held up his screwdriver and pointed at the high-tech smart lock already half-installed on the gate. "Ma'am, I literally have a work order to be here. Your HOA hired me to upgrade these locks." The cops exchanged a glance. One of them, Officer Delgado, rubbed his temple like he was fighting the urge to sigh. "Ma'am, do you have proof that he's not supposed to be here?" Karen gasped, clutching her chest like she'd been struck by a spiritual revelation. What do you mean proof? Look at him. She cut herself off, realizing that completing that sentence would take her from concerned citizen to certified racist in record time. "He just looks suspicious, okay?" Dante clicked his tongue. "Oh, that's cute. Real original." The other officer, a younger guy named Officer Parker, tilted his head. "Sir, do you have ID or anything showing you're working here?" Dante nodded, pulling out his phone. "Sure do." He tapped a few times and pulled up an email from the Homeowners Association, complete with the job details. "Check it out, scheduled install. They even gave me gate access to update the lock." Officer Delgado scanned the screen, then turned to Karen. "Ma'am, this looks legitimate." Karen's expression shifted between outrage and confusion, but Dante wasn't done yet. He tapped the lock screen, pulling up the system's access logs. "And here's something interesting. This smart lock tracks every time someone opens the gate. Want to take a guess whose code has been used at some very interesting hours?" Karen's face paled. "Excuse me?" Dante enlarged the screen and held it out. "Look at this. The logs show the same code being used to unlock the gate between 1 and 3 in the morning. And if I'm reading this right, that code is tied to your house." The silence was deafening. Even the cops blinked in surprise. Karen let out a high-pitched laugh that sounded more like a hiccup. "That's ridiculous. Someone must have hacked it." Dante raised an eyebrow. "Must be one hell of a hacker, who somehow only hacks into the system to use your personal code at suspicious hours. That's some wild coincidence." Officer Delgado folded his arms. "Ma'am, do you have an explanation for this?" Karen looked around, as if someone in the empty street would come to her rescue. Her lips closed, then parted again before she blurted out, I was checking for trespassers." Dante whistled low. "At 2 in the morning? You patrolling the lake now? You got a flashlight and a security badge to go with that sun hat." Karen's face turned bright red. "I don't have to explain myself to you." Parker clicked his pen and jotted something down. "You actually might have to. If someone was using your access code and we find out you reported a false emergency call, that's a problem." Dante smirked, watching Karen unravel before his eyes. "Oh, and just for fun, let's check the security footage linked to this system." Karen's breath hitched. What? Dante tapped the lock's interface and connected it to his tablet. A few seconds later, a grainy night vision recording popped up, showing the gate swinging open at 2:12 a.m. A woman's silhouette, one that looked suspiciously like Karen, stepped through, glancing around before waving someone in. The second figure, taller and broader, stepped inside. Dante zoomed in. The mystery man's face wasn't clear, but his car was visible, parked just a few feet away from the entrance. And Dante, tech-savvy as ever, knew exactly how to pull up a plate number with a little image enhancement. Karen's voice came out in a whisper. That's not me." Dante chuckled. "Oh, it's definitely you. But the bigger question is, who's your late-night guest?" Karen stumbled back. This is an invasion of privacy." Officer Delgado sighed, rubbing his temples again. "Ma'am, I think we're done here. You called us for a man doing his job, and instead, we've got you on camera doing something questionable. If you don't have a reasonable explanation, we might have to look into this further." Karen's jaw clenched. "This is harassment. I am a well-respected member of this community, and I will not be treated like a criminal." Dante grinned. "Well, funny thing about that. You treated me like one just a few minutes ago. But now? I'm just an innocent bystander watching karma work its magic." Parker hid a smirk behind his notepad. Ma'am, if you'd like to file an official statement, we can do that back at the station. Karen's eyes widened. To the station? Dante locked eyes with her, letting the moment settle. You sure you want to keep pushing this, Karen? For a second, it looked like she might explode. Then, her lips pursed so tight they practically disappeared. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed off. Dante watched her go, shaking his head. Man, this job gets wilder every day. Officer Delgado patted his shoulder. You're a patient man. Not really, Dante said. I just enjoy a good plot twist. As the cops left, Dante turned back to the smart lock, but his curiosity lingered on the footage. Something about the mystery man felt off. He pulled up another set of records, cross-referencing data. And then he saw the name attached to the vehicle. Dante's eyebrows shot up. Well, damn. That's not Karen's husband's car. He exhaled a slow whistle. This was about to get interesting. Dante sat on the edge of his work van, staring at his tablet screen. The name attached to the car from the footage wasn't Brad Whitmore, Karen's husband. It belonged to someone else entirely. Someone Dante recognized. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he tapped into the smart lock system again, running a deeper scan on previous entries. The lock stored logs for the last 6 months, and with a few more taps, he pulled up the full access history. The same code had been used at odd hours multiple times a month, always between 1 and 3 in the morning. He narrowed his eyes. This wasn't just some random incident. Someone had been sneaking in here for a while. He zoomed in on the plate number again, enhancing the image through a software tool he used for security checks. The resolution sharpened just enough for him to make out a few key details on the vehicle. Black sedan, custom rims, a scratch near the back left bumper. Definitely not Brad's. His mind raced through possibilities. The neighborhood was an exclusive, gated community, mostly quiet, full of people who paid extra for security and privacy. If someone was sneaking around at night, it had to mean one of two things. They were doing something they didn't want anyone to know about, or they were meeting someone who didn't want to be seen. He leaned back, exhaling through his nose. So, Karen, he muttered under his breath. Who the hell are you messing with? Before he could dig further, a voice interrupted his thoughts. Hey, Dante, right? He turned his head to see Brad Whitmore, standing a few feet away. Dressed in a crisp polo and khaki shorts, he looked every bit the wealthy suburban husband. His face, however, told a different story. There was tension in his jaw, a stiffness in his stance, like a man who knew something was off but hadn't quite figured out what. Dante stood up, slipping his tablet under his arm. That's me. Brad hesitated before speaking. Listen, I heard there was an issue earlier. My wife called the cops or something. Dante smirked. Oh yeah. She saw a black guy doing his job and had a full-blown meltdown. Real entertaining stuff. Brad sighed, rubbing his temples. Jesus Christ. I'm really sorry about that. She gets paranoid sometimes. Dante shrugged. Yeah, I noticed. Brad let out a dry chuckle, but his eyes flickered with something else, concern. Look, is there anything I need to know about the lock? Any issues with the installation? Dante studied him for a beat. It was an innocent enough question, but there was something in his tone. Something careful. Cautious. No issues, Dante said slowly. Just going through the logs, making sure everything's working right. Brad nodded a little too quickly. Good. That's good. Dante watched as the man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly debating something internally. Then finally he spoke again. This is going to sound like a weird question, Brad said, lowering his voice, but has anyone been using the gate at night? Dante kept his face neutral. Why do you ask? Brad hesitated. I don't know. Just sometimes I hear things. The gate clicking. A car driving off in the middle of the night. I've been meaning to check, but Karen always says it's nothing. Dante let the silence stretch for a second. Then he pulled out his tablet, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it toward Brad. Funny you should ask, Dante said. Because someone's been coming through here. Repeatedly. Brad's face changed instantly. His easygoing expression vanished, replaced by something sharper. He stepped closer, eyes fixed on the timestamps. What the hell? Dante scrolled through the footage. And it's not just once or twice. This is a pattern. Brad's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His hands clenched at his sides. Who was it? Dante hesitated. He wasn't the type to get involved in people's messes. But Brad was standing here, looking at the proof with his own eyes. It wasn't like he could deny it. Instead of answering outright, Dante tapped the video thumbnail. The footage played again, showing Karen sneaking through the gate, waving someone in. The man stepping through wasn't clear in the dark, but Dante had enhanced the plate number earlier. Brad sucked in a breath. No. No way. Dante tilted his head. You recognize the car? Brad's face hardened. His nostrils flared. That's Steve's car. Dante's eyebrows lifted slightly. Steve? Brad's voice came out like a growl. Steve Montgomery. My business partner. Dante exhaled slowly. Well, damn. That was worse than he expected. It wasn't some random mystery man sneaking in to meet Karen. It was Brad's own friend. Brad took a step back, running a hand through his hair. His face had gone pale. That son of a bitch. Dante stayed quiet. This was one of those moments where saying the wrong thing could make everything 10 times worse. Brad let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You know what the worst part is? I actually trusted the guy. I brought him into my company. I had him over for dinner with my family. He let out a hollow chuckle. Guess I should have been paying more attention. Dante slipped his tablet back under his arm. Look, man. I don't know what's going on between you and your wife, but this. He gestured toward the gate. This is shady as hell. Brad's jaw clenched. His hands flexed at his sides. Yeah, no kidding. He let out a breath, trying to steady himself. Thanks for showing me this. I appreciate it. Dante gave a small nod. No problem. Brad lingered for a second longer before turning on his heel and walking away. Dante watched him go, wondering just how much damage had just been done in a matter of minutes. As he turned back to his work, his tablet pinged with another notification. He glanced down. A new access attempt had just been logged. His pulse ticked up slightly. He tapped the screen, pulling up the real-time feed from the smart lock camera. Someone was at the gate. And it wasn't Karen. Dante's eyes narrowed. He zoomed in on the figure. Well. Speak of the devil. Steve Montgomery was standing at the entrance, looking over his shoulder nervously before pulling out his phone. Dante exhaled sharply. This was about to get real interesting. Dante watched Steve Montgomery through the smart lock's live feed, his mind racing through what he had just uncovered. The man looked nervous, glancing around every few seconds as if he expected someone to jump out of the bushes and catch him in the act. His phone was in his hand, and he was typing something quickly, his fingers moving in short, frantic bursts. Then, just as suddenly, he stopped and stared straight at the camera. Dante couldn't tell if it was paranoia or if Steve somehow knew someone was watching him. But the moment felt too perfect, like a villain in a movie realizing he had been caught. Dante muttered under his breath. Well, Steve, what are you up to? He didn't have to wait long for an answer. A few seconds later, Steve pulled something from his pocket, a small key fob. He held it up to the lock, but nothing happened. The screen remained unchanged, no access granted. Steve cursed under his breath and tried again. Still nothing. Dante smirked to himself. That was the thing about upgrading smart locks. Old access codes and key fobs got wiped out in the process. If Steve had been using a duplicate fob before, it was useless now. Steve shoved the useless fob back into his pocket and pulled out his phone again, dialing a number. Dante didn't need audio to know who he was calling. Sure enough, a few seconds later, Karen appeared in the feed, marching toward the gate with an expression that screamed frustration. She was dressed in a loose hoodie and sweatpants, her usual polished appearance replaced with something that suggested she had been caught off guard. She wasn't even wearing makeup, which for Karen was practically a sign of an emergency. She reached Steve and immediately started whispering, her hands moving wildly. Dante wished he could hear what they were saying, but their body language told him plenty. Karen looked pissed. Steve looked desperate. He leaned in, whispering something urgent, and Karen shot a glare toward the street before reluctantly typing something into the keypad. The lock clicked and Steve hurried inside. Dante sighed, shaking his head. This was beyond shady. Steve wasn't just sneaking in, he was being let in. And given the fact that Karen had called the cops on Dante earlier, trying to make it seem like he was the problem, the irony was so thick he could choke on it. Curiosity burned in his chest. He had all the footage he needed, but now he wanted more. He wanted to know what exactly was happening once Steve got inside. He glanced down at his tools, debating for a second. Then he made a decision. 2 minutes later, he had a small security drone hovering in the air, silent and sleek, moving just above the treetops. He had been testing the device for work, using it to check security vulnerabilities on properties, and right now, it was going to come in handy. He guided it forward, following the path Karen and Steve had taken. The lake area wasn't far, just a short walk from the fence. The drone's camera feed showed them stepping onto the dock, still deep in conversation. Karen's arms were crossed, her stance rigid. Steve was gesturing wildly, looking more panicked by the second. Dante zoomed in. Steve reached into his pocket and pulled something out, a small envelope. Karen snatched it from him, flipping it open. Her face shifted instantly from frustration to pure, unfiltered panic. She clutched the envelope like it had just announced the end of the world. Dante frowned, trying to make out the contents, but the angle was too off. All he could see was a flash of paper, something handwritten. Karen's hands were shaking. She hissed something at Steve, but he shook his head, stepping closer, saying something that made her face twist in horror. Then, suddenly, she shoved the envelope back into his chest, shaking her head furiously. Steve grabbed her wrist, not in an aggressive way, but in a pleading way, his body language screaming desperation. Dante's mind raced through the possibilities. Was it blackmail? A confession? Some kind of leverage Steve had over Karen? Whatever it was, she was scared, and Steve was not backing down. Then, just when Dante thought things couldn't get any weirder, another figure appeared at the edge of the dock. Brad. He had come from the opposite side of the lake, his footsteps silent against the wooden planks. Neither Karen nor Steve noticed him at first, too wrapped up in their argument. Then finally Karen turned her head, and her entire body went stiff. Steve followed her gaze, and his face drained of color. Brad took another step forward, his expression unreadable. His eyes flicked between the two of them, then landed on the envelope still clutched in Steve's hand. Nobody moved. Then, in a low, steady voice, Brad asked, "What the hell is going on here?" Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Steve took a small step back, as if debating whether to run. Brad's eyes narrowed. Someone better start talking. Steve was the first to break. "Brad, listen, man, this isn't what it looks like." Brad let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like my business partner sneaking around with my wife in the middle of the night." Karen finally found her voice. "Brad, please, I can explain." Brad cut her off with a sharp look. "No, I don't think you can." Dante watched the scene unfold, completely engrossed. The drone's feed gave him a perfect view, and he could see the way Karen kept glancing at the envelope, as if willing it to disappear. Brad saw it too. "What's in your hand, Steve?" Steve hesitated. It's nothing." Brad took another step forward. "Try again." Steve looked like a trapped animal. His fingers clenched around the envelope before he finally exhaled and muttered, "It's proof." Brad's jaw tensed. "Proof of what?" Steve looked at Karen, almost like he was waiting for her permission. But Karen just stood there, her face tight with silent rage. Finally, Steve made his choice. He opened the envelope, pulled out the paper inside, and handed it to Brad. Brad took it, scanned the contents, and then, his entire body went still. Dante could only imagine what was written, but whatever it was, it had changed everything in an instant. Brad's hands clenched around the paper, so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, in a voice that was almost too calm, he said, "You've got to be kidding me." Steve swallowed hard. "I didn't want you to find out this way, man." Brad looked up, his eyes dark. "Oh, you didn't want me to find out at all, Steve. That much is obvious." Karen took a hesitant step forward. "Brad, please, you have to understand." Brad turned on her so fast she flinched. "I don't have to understand a damn thing." His voice was shaking, but it wasn't with sadness. It was something colder. Dante had seen enough. He shut off the drone feed and leaned against his van, letting out a low whistle. Whatever was on that paper, it wasn't just about an affair. It was something bigger. And he had a feeling things were about to get a lot worse before they got better. Brad stared at the paper in his hands, his grip so tight the edges crumpled. His chest rose and fell sharply, and for a long moment he said nothing. The only sound was the quiet lapping of water against the dock. Karen stood stiffly a few feet away, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a tight line. Steve, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to evaporate into thin air. Dante, watching through the drone's feed, knew this wasn't just about an affair anymore. Whatever was on that paper had turned this from a messy personal situation into something much, much worse. Brad finally spoke, his voice eerily calm. "How long?" Steve hesitated, his hands twitching at his sides. "Brad, listen." Brad's head snapped up. "I said how long." Steve exhaled, running a hand down his face. "A year." Brad let out a hollow laugh. "A year. You mean to tell me that for an entire year, you were sneaking around with my wife, meeting her behind my back, and neither of you thought I'd find out? Karen stepped forward, her voice tight. Brad, it's not what you think. Brad turned on her so fast she took a step back. Oh, really? Because I'm pretty damn sure this is exactly what I think. He shook the paper in his hand. This isn't just about you two sneaking around. This is about money. Dante raised an eyebrow. Money. That was an unexpected twist. Karen's expression flickered with something unreadable. Brad, listen. Brad cut her off. Don't. Just don't. He took a deep breath, his fingers flexing like he was trying to stop himself from doing something he'd regret. Then he turned back to Steve. You used company money for this? Steve swallowed hard. It wasn't. Brad took a step closer, his voice dropping dangerously low. Don't lie to me, Steve. Steve flinched. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Brad barked out a humorless laugh. Oh, really? Then how exactly was it supposed to happen? Were you planning to keep screwing my wife while funneling money out of our business indefinitely? Were you ever going to tell me, or were you just waiting for me to notice when the numbers stopped adding up? Karen spoke up, her voice sharp. Brad, stop making a scene. Brad turned on her, his eyes blazing. A scene? You think this is a scene? He waved the paper. This is embezzlement. This is fraud. And this, he gestured between her and Steve. This is just pathetic. Steve's shoulders slumped. Look, man, I can fix this. Brad let out a low, disbelieving laugh. You can fix this? Steve, you stole from me. You stole from our company. You stole from my family. And on top of that, you were sleeping with my wife. How exactly do you plan to fix that? Steve had no answer. Dante shook his head as he listened in. This was worse than he thought. If Steve had been funneling company money to cover up his affair, Brad wasn't just dealing with betrayal. He was dealing with a financial crime. Brad took a step back, inhaling sharply. You know what? I don't need to hear any more of this. I'll deal with you later. He turned toward Karen. As for you, we're done. Karen's eyes widened slightly. Brad, don't be ridiculous. Brad gave her a look so cold it could have frozen the lake. Ridiculous? Karen, you called the cops on a man for installing a lock while you were sneaking around with my business partner and helping him steal from me. The only thing ridiculous here is that I ever trusted you. Karen crossed her arms, lifting her chin. You're overreacting. Brad exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You know what? I hope you and Steve have a great life together. You'll need it when I press charges. Steve's face drained of color. Brad, come on. Brad ignored him and pulled out his phone, tapping through his contacts. I'm calling my lawyer. First thing in the morning, I'm freezing our accounts. Karen's confidence wavered. Brad, let's talk about this. No, we're done talking. For the first time, Karen looked genuinely worried. Dante smirked to himself. He had a feeling Karen wasn't just worried about losing Brad. She was worried about losing the money that came with him. Steve tried again, his voice more desperate. Brad, listen, man, this is a misunderstanding. Brad's jaw clenched. Misunderstanding? You think I misunderstand what's on this paper? Because I can promise you, Steve, I know exactly what I'm looking at. Steve stepped forward, his hands raised slightly. I didn't mean for this to get out of control. Brad's laugh was bitter. Out of control? Steve, you stole nearly $100,000 from our company. You used it to book private hotels and fancy dinners while I was busting my ass keeping the business running. And now you want to tell me this got out of control? Steve dropped his gaze. I was going to pay it back. Brad's expression darkened. You don't get to steal and then decide when you pay it back. That's not how this works. Karen took a step forward, trying to play the voice of reason. Brad, let's not ruin everything over a mistake. Brad scoffed. A mistake? You mean the mistake of marrying you? Karen flinched, but she quickly masked it with indifference. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Brad shook his head in disbelief. Unbelievable. You're actually standing here, trying to downplay this. You don't even care, do you? Karen didn't answer. Brad let out a slow breath, his decision clearly made. I'll be filing for divorce. Effective immediately. Karen's mask finally cracked. Her eyes widened just a fraction, a flicker of panic crossing her face. Dante leaned against his van, watching it all unfold from his tablet. This was better than reality TV. Steve tried one last time. Brad, please. Brad cut him off with a sharp glare. Save it. I'll see you in court. Without another word, Brad turned and walked away, his strides purposeful, his grip still tight on the paper. Karen stood frozen, watching him go, her face unreadable. Steve exhaled shakily, raking a hand through his hair. That went well. Karen shot him a glare. Shut up, Steve. Dante chuckled to himself. This was far from over. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. By the next morning, the entire gated community was buzzing with the news. Brad Whitmore, usually the picture of composure, had sent out a mass email to his company and legal team, freezing accounts and cutting all ties with Steve Montgomery. A lawsuit was already in motion. But that wasn't even the juiciest part. No, the real spectacle was happening inside the neighborhood itself, where Karen had gone from queen of the HOA to public enemy number one overnight. Dante, sipping his coffee from the safety of his van, watched as neighbors gathered on their porches, whispering in hushed but excited voices. He didn't have to hear them to know what they were saying. Karen's perfect reputation was in shambles, and for someone who built her entire life around social status, that was worse than any legal battle. Karen, of course, refused to go down without a fight. She stormed into the HOA office first thing in the morning, demanding a meeting. Dante wasn't there, but he could imagine how it went. She probably tried to spin the story, make herself the victim. Maybe she even cried a little. But the problem was no one was buying it. Not after everything that had come to light. Linda, one of Karen's closest friends, was the first to turn on her. She had been overheard at the local coffee shop saying, "I always knew something was off about her. You don't just call the cops on someone for installing a smart lock unless you're trying to cover up your own mess." The whispers spread fast. By noon, Karen's usual clique had abandoned her. Invitations to community events were revoked. Her presence in the neighborhood group chats was met with icy silence. And the best part? The HOA fined her for making a false police report, adding insult to injury. Dante didn't feel bad. Not even a little. He had just finished packing up his tools when Brad walked up to him. The man looked exhausted but lighter, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "You finished with the install?" Brad asked, hands in his pockets. Dante nodded. "Yep. Everything's running smooth. New access codes are in place, old ones wiped. No more surprise visitors." Brad let out a breath. "Good. That's the only silver lining in this mess." Dante smirked. "How's Karen taking it?" Brad chuckled dryly. "Like you'd expect. She's in full meltdown mode. She tried to tell me I was overreacting, then she tried to guilt-trip me, then she started threatening to take everything in the divorce." Dante raised an eyebrow. "She got a lawyer already?" Brad shook his head. "Nah, she's just throwing out threats. But good luck to her. My lawyer's already way ahead of her." Dante took a sip of his coffee, nodding. "And Steve?" Brad's expression darkened. "Hiding. He hasn't shown his face since last night. Sent me some pathetic text about how he never meant for things to get out of hand, and how he hopes we can work something out." Dante let out a low whistle. "Yeah, that's not happening." "Not a chance," Brad confirmed. "I'm pressing full charges. The financial investigation is already underway. Turns out he was siphoning money for months, not just for Karen, but for a whole lot of other expenses too. He's looking at serious jail time." Dante wasn't surprised. Steve had always seemed like the type to think he was too smart to get caught. People like that always made stupid mistakes in the end. Brad ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "You know, if you had told me a week ago that my business partner was stealing from me and my wife was cheating on me with him, I'd have laughed in your face." Dante shrugged. "Yeah, life comes at you fast." Brad chuckled. "That it does." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as Karen walked across the street toward her house, her head held high despite the fact that no one even acknowledged her. She still had that air of entitlement, like she thought she could will people into forgetting what she had done. Dante shook his head. "You think she'll leave?" Brad sighed. "Eventually. But she's stubborn. She'll stick around as long as she thinks she can salvage her reputation." Dante snorted. "Good luck with that." Brad smiled faintly. "No kidding." A few hours later, as Dante was wrapping up his final system checks, his tablet pinged with a notification. He frowned, pulling it up. It was an alert from the smart lock system, an attempted unauthorized access. His eyes narrowed. Someone was trying to use an old code. Dante tapped into the live feed, and what he saw made him laugh out loud. Steve Montgomery stood at the gate, punching in numbers furiously, his face twisted in frustration. Dante shook his head, opening the intercom feature. "Hey, Steve," he said casually. Steve froze, his head snapping up toward the camera. His eyes darted around, like he was hoping he had misheard. Yeah, I'm talking to you, Dante continued, barely containing his amusement. What's the matter? Lock not working. Steve's jaw tightened. Let me in. Dante grinned. Yeah, that's not going to happen. Steve glared at the camera. I have stuff inside. Dante shrugged. Not my problem. Steve's nostrils flared. You don't get to decide that. Dante laughed. Actually, I do. See, I'm the one who installed the system. And as of right now, you don't exist in it anymore. Steve clenched his fists. This is ridiculous. Dante tilted his head. You know what else is ridiculous? Stealing from your business partner. Sleeping with his wife. Trying to sneak back into a neighborhood where you're not wanted. I mean, really, Steve, what's the endgame here? Steve said nothing. Dante smirked. Yeah, that's what I thought. You should probably leave before someone calls the cops. Steve shot one last glare at the camera before turning on his heel and storming off. Dante leaned back in his seat, satisfied. Karma had done its job. The next day, Karen officially filed for divorce, but it wasn't the power move she thought it would be. Brad had already frozen their assets, and thanks to the financial scandal Steve had created, Karen's chances of walking away with a fortune were slim to none. By the end of the week, she had quietly put her house on the market. The community was done with her, and even she had to accept that no amount of scheming could fix the damage she had done. Dante never saw her again after that. A month later, Brad reached out to let him know that Steve had been formally charged with embezzlement and fraud. The company had survived, but just barely. Brad was picking up the pieces, and while the betrayal still stung, he was moving on. As for Dante, he got a hefty bonus from the HOA for his trouble, along with a permanent contract to manage their security systems. And as he sat in his van, watching the newly installed smart lock blink reassuringly, he couldn't help but smile. Some jobs were just more satisfying than others.